Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so in today's video, I want to talk about a topic of why young men become cruel. And this isn't a new thing. You could see this in Nazi Germany. You could see this in fascist Italy. Hell, you could even see it to some degree with like the Maoist Red Guards in China too, back in the day. And so the thing is, there's a common trend where younger people just tend to become, crueler as time goes on. And so the fact is, it was paired with a comment that I got from a boomer, that was basically talking about that he doesn't understand like why the woke right, as he calls it, is becoming more prominent, and young Republicans and young right-wingers are flocking to people like Nick Fuentes. And, people, they're not, the young right is abandoning the Trump train, they're abandoning MAGA, but they're not embracing the mainstream Democratic Party either. And I've said multiple times on the channel that both the Republican and Democrat Party mostly exist as a filter to the so-called democratic system that only allow the opinions that they want to allow in the first place. The parties act as a filter of allowable political discussion within the Republic. And beyond that, the democratic system really doesn't exist. And so the thing is that I want to speak mostly to young men in this regard, because I've made 2 videos thus far on this topic, and I kind of want to hammer it home with this final talking point. Is because the fact is I've talked about it, there's just kind of like, unending like cultural assumption, like even on both the political right and the political left, that young men have this kind of hidden privilege or benefit that they really don't have. And that's kind of the funny part, is because while they're being told that they're privileged, under the same breath, you will see some of the most Darwinistic, like, talking points used against young men at the same time under the assumption of their privilege. It's like, for instance, it's like I came across this post from a supposed conservative feminist that they want to pass a bachelor tax for single men over the age of 30. And so the interesting thing is that like it's already a well-known fact that single men fare economically poor in compared to, married men. Okay, and so I've hammered home on this channel a lot of the times is that the hatred that a lot of young men talk about, right, is not so much that they're hated for being men. That was the failed assumption that they made from the political left back in the day, was assuming that the left hated men for being men, when in fact, a lot of the times is they see them as lesser men for not following up to some arbitrary standard. You can even see this with the Kamala Harris campaign about, the whole like gay masculinity LARP. Oh, we have real men in our party. Real men care about women nonsense. And so the thing is the young right is also kind of realizing it. The fact is that, that there is this kind of category that they're being shoved into where they're not considered real men. They're not considered, true men unless they do X, Y, and Z. And there's this almost Darwinistic selection that if you don't follow the rules, you're kind of seen as a lesser human being. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that it's ironic that the language and the discussion around young men is so poisoned on this cultural assumption of just, unearned privilege. But, listen to their language and it's almost borderline Darwinistic when they say, we don't think your genes should pass. Okay, especially when they want to basically penalize anybody who is not participating in the system over the age of 30. It's insult to injury over that regard. Now, I think this is a mistake of the ruling class, okay? And the thing is, I don't have it exactly, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, because this is not the first time the ruling class has utilized, feminism to antagonize young men. You might think this is, but I want to go into a little bit of a side spiels, because the fact is, I think this will be useful information to those who are interested in talking about young men's role when it comes to particular class warfares, because you might think this is just, women and feminism being twats on their own, but in fact, there is a class bias on this fact. Like, a lot of people can, intuitively understand that fact, but let me give you a little bit of evidence. Okay, if you're familiar with World War I and, white feather feminism, as I called it, right? If you remember the suffragettes who would go around bombing facilities in the name of women's rights because they wanted the right to vote, just like, the earlier Republican systems were giving, enfranchisement to property-owning men, the interesting thing is you had a political surgence of feminists who wanted to basically give political enfranchisement to women. Fair enough. Okay, whatever, right? If you're a pro-democracy kind of person, you believe in a republic, equal enfranchisement, whatever, right? I'm not here to discuss about the 19th Amendment because that's not the point of the video. But the thing is when the suffragettes were going around burning down buildings and burning their bras because they wanted equal enfranchisement to men, the interesting thing happened is that when World War I began, okay, and, generals and members of the nobles of the British aristocracy were looking for men to fight and die in their wars in World War I. They needed a way to cudgel young men into fighting for their cause, okay? And so that's where the white feather campaigns began, is because the fact is certain members of the British aristocracy and nobility, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, I'll just provide a picture and a name on the screen when I get the chance, is that they found a very clever way to antagonize young men by holding their masculinity over their head, considering them lesser men if they didn't fight and die on behalf of the British Empire. And to some degree it worked, and this is why I kind of title these people as white feather feminists. And you're kind of finding this out, like, basically exactly like how a lot of bourgeois feminism exists in the Western world, is that, that it does hand in hand work with the ruling classes to antagonize younger men into the service of the ruling class. Now, not always. Like, not all members of the ruling class are obviously pro-feminist and all that nonsense. You can see sections of the ruling class that don't really care about that stuff. But the fact is that there were elements of the British aristocracy that got the ideas that if they antagonized young men by handing out white feathers, calling them not real men or cowards, that it would increase enlistment into the British Army and the Navy. And to some degree, it did partially work. But again, like, that's the dynamic I've criticized on this channel. It's that, when it comes to this society, it's like, they do hold your manhood over your head, and try to get, basically use the carrot stick method to basically force you into following what they want you to do, i.e. enlisting in the military and being a state, an instrument of the bourgeois state. Like, so the thing is, none of this is exactly new. The problem is that, even if you wanted to follow, and I've said this a couple of times on this channel, if you're a young guy and you might agree with all the cultural values of conservatism, here's where they got you, man. Here's the catch-22, is that even if you agreed with the values that they espouse, right, the economic condition doesn't even permit you to do this. This is why I talked about the incel crisis in South Korea, is because the fact is that you have this traditionalist culture, and it's the expectation that men have to follow within that society. And on top of that, they have no avenue or reasonable path of achieving that level of prosperity or recognition or even respect within society, which would be, a part of the status of manhood, okay? And that's the problem, okay? Because young men can't achieve this sort of stuff, because of the economic situation, they become incredibly disenfranchised and angry at the system, is because the fact is they feel like they don't have a path forward, okay? The funny part is when you say that it all goes down to class at the end of the day, is because the fact is like certain hallmarkers of adulthood are being gatekept from an entire generation of young men. Most people tend to tune out on that talking point, is because they believe it doesn't even exist, okay? And that is the insult, the insult added to injury to the situation that young men are facing, especially in the United States. The average house price as of today is $525K. And to add insult to injury to a group of people who are already having difficulty finding partners in the first place, who already know that their life prospects are worse off in comparison to married men, they're going to become incredibly resentful. And unfortunately, the fact is the ruling class doesn't realize it. And this is especially boomers, the smart ass who keeps coming on my channel, doesn't realize it. Like, these people are going to carry forward a revolution, whether that's a communist revolution or a nationalist revolt. It doesn't really matter at this point. It's whoever can basically give the best case to this demographic to say, this is going to deliver you a better future. I've given my 2 cents on why I think, my politics is the answer to that problem. And all that nonsense. But the thing is that one way or another, it's going to happen. So, the boomer who came up to me and said that he was surprised that, the rise of Nick Fuentes and the woke right, and the fact that people are in droves abandoning the Democratic Party, they're abandoning neoliberalism in favor of hard economic left positions. Well, I've got one thing to tell you, okay? Because the fact is I came across a post that was talking about, this great thing about, you were born in 1905, and, shortly after 10 years later, you had to go through World War I. Then you had to go through the Spanish flu. Right? You had the Great Depression shortly after that. You had hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, and then you had World War II that came after that. And the interesting thing is that, this boomer always likes to, and then he says, someone born in 1985 likes to pretend that their life is hard. And it's always funny is because there's always some dipshit post-1945 born boomer, some boomer born after 1945 in America, that likes to pretend that he is this generation. And it's ironic is because the fact is if you do a comparison between the cost of living between people in the 1920s and people in the 2020s, they almost have relatively, equivalent standards of living. Namely that they have very limited prospects. That's why the reason the 1920s was known as the second Gilded, or the Gilded Age, okay, is because the fact is you had tremendous swaths of wealth inequality, and you also had the rise of radical politics. And so, to that boomer, I've got to say one thing. You cannot be surprised that younger generations are abandoning liberalism and liberal democracy in droves, including myself, and embracing the nationalist right and the communist left, when you have created an entire economy and you passively let it happen, where the vast majority of people now have the same standard of living as the people in the 1920s. I'm sorry, my boomer friend, but if you don't want people to have the same politics as the people from the 1920s, you shouldn't give them the same standard of living as the people in the 1920s, okay? If you don't want people to have the same politics, because let's also look at in the 1920s. You had the beer hall putsch in the 1923, okay? You had several fighting factions between the nationalist right and the communist left. And I hate to say it, but if you're going to give people the same standard of living as the people in that era, you can't be upset when people start adopting the same politics of the people who lived in that very same era. Like, you know, it's funny. The people who are born after 1945 really would love to believe that they're the silent generation when they're really not. When you look at the average Gen Z or a late millennial, they have a pretty much identical, you know, outcome or even cost of living situation as the people, you know, that came before boomers. But boomers love to LARP about it, which is kind of funny, is because the fact is they love to LARP as this generation that were predominantly nationalist and communist. Were incredibly racist and hard economically left, but then they use that to ideologically justify liberal democracy. And you want to talk about peak, you know, delusional boomer meandering. That's it. It's like nobody from that generation would be supporting liberal capitalism. They'd either be a communist or a nationalist boomer. Okay? And so that's kind of the ironic part, is that while he's LARPing as this generation, he's getting really upset, is because most of the people from that generation he's pretending to be would probably agree with the younger generations on the politics that they have. With that being said, I think I've got my 2 cents out of the way. This wasn't going to be a too terribly long video. It's just the fact is I want to kind of talk about, you know, the reasons why young men become cruel. Okay? And it has everything to do with the economic situation that they've been given, while also simultaneously being gaslit about it. Okay? And so, you know, there's not, this is just a rant video. It's not like meant to be a formal essay or anything like that. Again, this has always been like a 2 cents channel. And so I'm just uploading my 2 cents. So, you know, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hope to see you in the next video.